It is. At the International Cryptozoology Conference in 2018, when I made it like a little brief appearance there, I actually did see you and Nate. I noticed both of you walking
Hmm.
around doing
Yes,
stuff.
that was the first conference that I went to, was the 2018 conference. I actually have a T-shirt from the occasion,
Oh,
which is.
I had it on yesterday actually.
Did you really?
Just because it was one of the T-shirts that was available to wear, and I stuck it on, and you know, it was a clean T-shirt. So I put it
Right.
on.
Well, fantastic. They were very well designed T-shirts. They looked pretty
Yeah,
good.
very nice. Yes, they were very, very nice. Um, yeah. So I saw you guys there, both of you, and I just am a nosy person, and I'm always kind of looking around to see what's going on. And I
Hmm.
thought to myself, there's something interesting about these guys. Um, there's like a whole lot of geekdom going on, but in a really cool way. They know what's going on with this thing deeply, and they're clearly really into it. I thought, yeah, I like them, and I meant to come and talk to you, but it just never happened. There was people
Hmm.
around. I got dragged off at the end, and it was done.
Yes, right,
Um,
right.
yeah. So anyway, Crash Course Cryptozoology. I love it because it's alliteration, and I'm addicted to alliteration.
It's
Uh,
so funny. We actually don't work together anymore, but when I was still working with Nate,
uh,
one of the things he said so often was, "I love naming things with alliteration." Same way, he's addicted to it.
I have a saying, and it might not be my saying. I believe I made it up. I'm not sure if I did it, which is always alliterate anonymously.
Interesting.
Yeah, good.
I like it.
Well, but if I wanted to catch on, it can't be my saying because it kind of defeats the object.
Mm,
Um, yeah. So, Crash, it's great alliteration, but it's just such a nice idea. And I go on your channel a lot, look at the videos. I love the idea of just giving people an overview because so often in this genre, we're sort of talking amongst each other like colleagues and friends on all the groups as well. All the same guys kind of chatting about the behind the scenes details, and this is not very good for the general listener with a passing interest. A rudimentary interest in the subject. It's not fun and it's not interesting.
mm,
But what I like about some of the way that you present things is it does give them facts and details, but it gives it to them in a way that they can understand. They don't have to have a deep background knowledge in the
mm.
subject to enjoy it, which is, being short and simple and sweet is one of my ambitions. Never achieved it, but it's up there for one of those things. So let's just talk about that. Why did you start it?
Mm.
What's the point of it? What are you trying to achieve with this group?
Mm. Well, as far as I'm concerned with it, I think that I probably formed Crash Course Cryptozoology. I formed it back in March of 2017, actually. Um, for I think roughly the reasons that by your account it's fulfilled so far, which is fantastic. Which is that I want to be able to provide, or at least I would like there to be provided, a way for people, both inside and outside of the field,
Hmm.
to comprehensively actually understand the issues that cryptozoology finds itself dealing with.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that, by issue, I mean subjects in general. And I think that's quite an important avenue to take because, of course, one of the reasons that cryptozoology is considered pseudoscience is probably because of the controversial nature of most of its subject matter.
Mm.
Um, something that's beyond the normal controversy into, well, there's questions being asked in cryptozoology that are perhaps premature to ask. Um, for instance, if we were to talk about, uh, let's say, the statistical analysis of purported behavior in Sasquatch sightings,
Uh-huh.
for many people, that's not the first question that you should ask, and really it isn't. The first question you should ask is, do we agree that there's even an animal to be talked about in this subject, or should we be agreeing that it's a psychological phenomenon? And in that
Uh-huh.
case, questions should then proceed after that. And I think that to take a field like this seriously, which I do think that it can be, we have to be able to look at it in the same ways that we look at the other sciences, which is that we need to ask questions that need to be asked before we ask the ones that are fun to ask necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And we also, I think, inversely, need to find the adventure of asking such questions that might seem a bit mundane. Um, Especially in a field like cryptozoology, there's something that I said to Eli Watson, who is the host of Cryptid Campfire.
Mm-hmm.
It was something like we were discussing how people misidentify sounds sometimes. And we were actually camping and we heard a barn owl that sounded very much like a few Sasquatch recordings that we had heard. And I think one of us said something like, well, if it's not Bigfoot data, it's why people think they've heard of Bigfoot data.
Mm.
And that to me is just as important as Bigfoot data, because the goal of cryptozoology, as far as I can tell, is to not to prove the existence of animals that are only purported to exist or to disprove them. It's to figure out why that's a phenomenon in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a really good inquiry to take. And I think that in that sense, cryptozoology sits at the center of so many different sciences. And in that sense, I think I created Crash Course Cryptozoology to be able to contextualize cryptozoology not just as a science, but as a nexus of sciences, so that when people get to the avenue that Crash Course Cryptozoology has hopefully opened up, it's an avenue that brings them not only down the direction of, ooh, I get to see all these cool new cases that aren't talked about as much, maybe because I try to look for those a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But you also get to hear different sides of the story that they're not tainted by confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, or at least I try my best to make sure that they're not. And I think that that's something the field desperately needs right now.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you. And that's one of the things I like about it. I think it can be fun. I think it can be interesting
Mm.
in its very base, in its very in just the precepts of what we're looking for. That's fun in itself. And as you say, really we are learning, we are trying to run before we can walk with many of these things
Yes.
in a, such as Sasquatch behavior. Now, what's interesting to me about that, especially in line with confirmation bias, and I'd like to get your opinion on this,
Mm.
is the sensitivity that comes along with some of these things. So, from my perspective, from being a person that's steeped in a religious background but also loves psychology, I always view it as the corporate religion has kind of died out somewhat in our societies, and therefore there is a religion-shaped hole in
Mm.
in people because of the culture we come from, and we like to project something of a belief or something of a core philosophy onto the things that we like.
Mm.
So I had a guy, a really nice guy here, and he was out with his son recording, and he'd say, "Oh, that's not a crow. That's a Bigfoot. They when they know we're here, they mimic crows to tell each other that we're around." And I said, "Okay, that's fair enough, but there are also crows in that
Mm.
forest, so you can't eliminate a crow,
Mm.
whether it's a Bigfoot or not." And then he said they also mimic children. Whilst I was out with my son, we recorded the voice of a child, and my son says it wasn't him. I said, "I believe your son, and it's wonderful you made this recording, but you did have a child with you at the
Mm.
time." So, from an objective point of view, you can see how really nothing that you've recorded has any evidential value, because
Mm.
everything within that scenario that you're describing can be explained away. Now, it's nothing personal. It's just the situation for everybody who doesn't know you and trust you.
Mm.
That's how a scientist would look at it and say, "Well, you had a boy with you. There are crows in the forest. What exactly are you telling me you found?
Mm.
Crows and boys."
Yes, exactly. Which is it's
uh,
so interesting that you
yeah.
mentioned,
Hmm.
because I think that that's exactly the kind of pitfall that's encountered on the way to on the path to finding the actual scientific value of cryptozoological endeavors.
Hmm.
Um, because so much of the time, especially I think in the way that cryptozoology is presented in popular media, it's very much the case in both that presentation and in the actuality of cryptozoology that, again, conclusions are rushed to, despite other factors. more obvious factors in some cases, even beyond a child actually being there. Well, are you living in a neighborhood? Are you living in anything resembling a neighborhood? How do you know there aren't other kids actually just out there? And the answer is you don't know that.
Mm.
So the problem that then arises is, well, how can one actually come to the conclusion that cryptozoology is a science if that's the kind of thing that keeps happening? And I think that the answer is when you when you conduct a scientific inquiry, you have to play by the rules of science. And the reason you do is because science is actually a very accurate process, as it turns out. And one of the fundamental rules of analyzing potential evidence is Occam's razor, which is essentially the scientific protocol that says, okay, we have to go with what seems to be the most obvious answer, at first at least, because that tends to open up chains that lead us to the most accurate answers,
Mm.
even in outliers, because then at least we're not coming up with things that don't exist to replace what ends up just being a strange outlier. Um, and I think that when you do that, and you follow that through with cryptozoology, and you get past things like hearing sounds in the woods that you can't quite attribute to much of anything, in specific anyway,
Mm.
what you end up finding is certain cases that really do highlight, yes, there is a scientific legitimacy to this field. And I think a great example of that is this one is one that I've had on my mind for probably half a year to a year now. It's such an incredible sighting. A sighting of an alleged Yeti by a Russian naturalist named Arkady Tishkov
Mm.
in, I think, the early 1970s. This might have been before then or after then. Who knows? But he was on this glaciological expedition with a Chinese party, and they were along the border of Nepal and Tibet. And he is a naturalist. He's still alive, actually, who has won tons of awards in his field. He's a very credited person, very legitimate person, and has never dipped his toes into anything like cryptozoology ever before or since this happened. He had an alleged sighting, observed this animal supposedly for a long time, wrote a scientific paper about it, and actually even ends off the paper by saying, I don't plan to revisit this subject.
Mm.
Um, which, you might wonder why someone would want that. And when you consider that he's a very credential ridden person, it doesn't really become any more obvious why.
Mm.
And it's all about the fact that then your legitimacy perceived by others is on the line, your reputation is on the line. But he found it important enough to write about and to take photos of, and the photos aren't that great. All they show really is a moving object. But the point is that I can't think of a single hole to poke in that story.
Mm.
This isn't somebody who did this for popularity. He was already as popular as he could possibly be. He's one of Russia's most famous naturalists. He has a wonderful job. He's had many wonderful jobs. And he didn't seem to do this to fool people because he made some pretty crappy photos if he did. Um, and he said, I would like to never talk about this ever again in his
Wow.
paper.
And I think
So, what do you
it's
make of
really
that?
what you're looking for. Yeah, it's really what you're looking for, and it's a phenomenon I encounter a lot with some Loch Ness sightings from
Mm,
credible people, let's say, people with professions that are at risk, is that sometimes you cannot unsee what you've seen. When somebody
mm,
has an experience like that, they somehow sometimes they can't stop talking about it. They can't deny what they've seen, even when it costs them something.
mm,
And that seems to be the case with this particular gentleman. I did watch that video. I
mm,
thought it very, very interesting. And what is your opinion about talking about things like that, about the genre in general? As you've talked about some of the credibility issues that cryptozoology faces. Now, when it comes to cryptozoologists or researchers trying to make ends meet in cryptozoology, there's this uncomfortable pairing with sensationalism that's needed,
mm,
especially in the age of social media, to gain followers, to gain. Some people have patrons and PayPals and all the rest of it, and they're always out having experiences with the forest folk who, coincidentally, they never managed to capture on camera, even though they appear to be very, very close to them, best of friends, right?
right.
Gifting and bringing them in and wood knocks and the rest of it. There's always some sort of GoFundMe going at the bottom. And I just want, what's your opinion on this? Is this really detrimental to the subject, or do we need it and yet have to manage it a little better than we have been to carry on, having interest and having people who will pay for our exploits?
Hmm. You know, that's a really good question, and I must admit that I haven't really necessarily thought of that under the question of whether or not we actually need that functionally.
Mm.
Um, I think it's quite possible that we do need a bit of that because most things need a tiny bit of chaos to maintain some proper order.
Hmm.
And well, if I had to speculate, I guess I would say it probably, well, it certainly does play a role in getting cryptozoology out there, that's for sure.
Hmm.
Whether or not it's the right kind is another question. I think that what I would say is it seems to be the case that cryptozoology has gotten popular through two main means. And that is through sensationalism of that sort, which is rather negative, let's say,
Hmm.
or it's of a more headline-like sense. Examples are the big Bigfoot boom of like the 1950s or so, where that's not really as what would you even say? It's not as negative of press, but
Hmm.
it was still press, and it wasn't, that detailed of inquiry press. It was just press, and maybe that was needed for a long time. But I think that currently, that being withstanding, I'm hoping that not just cryptozoology, but science in general can kind of move past the vague headline
Mm.
stage of being able to be popularized. Because, for one thing, cryptozoology hits the road bump a lot with negative press because, let's face it, we have a lot of ammunition for that. Um, it's true, it's true. Like what you
There's a
mentioned,
few bits here and there floating
it's
about,
more of
sure,
that
yeah,
than it does the actual inquiry,
yeah.
which is regrettable, but it's the case. Now, the thing about this also is that science itself seems to have some trouble getting past that headline stage,
Mm.
except for very, very big things, I would say. And one of the good things that we're finding now is that more and more, as we move away from newspapers and into websites, news websites, there are tons of scientific, specifically science
Mm.
dedicated websites that do give articles on new information that is in proper detail and does properly outline the findings and doesn't just leave the viewer with the results, but also how those results were arrived at. And that's a good understanding of the results to have because if you don't understand that, you don't really learn much of anything, I would say. So hopefully cryptozoology can move something towards that. I think that as cryptozoology is popping up more and more online, hopefully we're getting to that. I would certainly say that cryptozoology, in the sense of the press, is getting more and more, well, perhaps less and less negative.
Mm.
We're seeing people treat cryptozoology, and this isn't exactly what maybe we should be striving for, but it's better than what it was before, and it's that it's fun. It's something that's
Mm.
actually enjoyable as a subject, and that's better than there's a bunch of crazy dudes out there looking for a big hairy man in the woods sort of thing. Um, yeah, I think that maybe we do need some of that to help us along to a certain point. I'm not sure when that certain point would arrive. Maybe it's on the horizon. I'm not even sure what that certain point would look like yet. I haven't given much thought to it.
Do
But
you think it could be something like the discovery and scientific acceptance of a large unknown species of
hmm,
animal? So, for instance, okay, the giant squid, that's kind of been going on for a while, but photographing, filming them in the wild
hmm,
is a very recent thing. So that really brought that to many people's attention and say, well, actually, well, if there's something like that around, maybe there are other things as well
hmm,
in recent times. But if we were to find a large animal, because of course we find new species all the time, they're just small animals, different frogs and birds and insects and fish. And there's a great places that catalog those sightings online. I mean, like Strange Ark and
hmm,
others. I'm a a big fan of Dr. Carl Schuker, and I love his books.
hmm,
And one of the things I really love about that is he doesn't always focus on the rock stars of cryptozoology. There's so many of the other little known cryptids that have never been um, discovered officially, but also that aren't really ever talked about anywhere else. Do you think it's going to take one of those big, well-known species like a Sasquatch, like a lake monster of some kind, or another, to get it recognized out there. And is that something that's likely actually to take place within regular science anyway? I mean,
Right.
all of these great cryptids of the past or the new species, it's generally not cryptozoologists who are finding them. Right?
Mm.
Science is finding them. So, I mean, it's not really a question. I guess it's more of a rant. But what is our place in that? What is
Mm.
our place in that? And are we helping or are we hindering?
Right. Well, I think that I would say cryptozoology does have a hand in that. It has a lot of hands in that because this is a concept I came up with a while ago, earlier this year, and I like to call it crypto connectivity.
Uh-huh.
The idea is that cryptozoology is something like and when it's properly conducted, an
Mm-hmm.
amalgamation of several different sciences. It's like it's at the center of a web, and every string on the web coming out from that center that is cryptozoology attaches to a different science. And the reason is because when you conduct a cryptozoological inquiry, basically around 100 other sciences need to take into consideration. That could be geography, topography, that could be geology, that could be anthropological archaeology, that could be psychology, that could be regular zoology, wildlife biology, you name it. It's all got a hand in there because there's that many factors that you need to consider when you're asking yourself, is there an animal here being reported that we don't know about yet?
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, I do think that cryptozoology has a card to play, so to speak, because we have had animals that used to be cryptids enter the light through regular scientific inquiry, which I think that considering the crypto connectivity model, it's harder to separate cryptozoology from established sciences, which is probably a good thing. Now, usually we have the anecdotes of like the mountain girl and the okapi.
Mm-hmm.
There's a much more recent one that I think should be a much more popular anecdote because it really shows it's probably the best example I think that we have of folklore addressing an actual animal that we just didn't know about yet. And it happened right here in North America. So I think it was December of 2018. Um, there was officially described, I think in Georgia, this new species or subspecies, at least, of salamander called the reticulated siren. If you know what an oxalotl looks like, it looks a bit like
Yeah.
that, but this much bigger kind of, that webbed mane that they kind of have, much
I used
larger.
I used to have them. I used to keep them, axolotls.
Yes, you have
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And they're darker in color and they have these kind of darker spots on them, and they
Mm.
look like their leopard pattern. For decades before this species was discovered, locals were seeing these things in swamps and they called them leopard eels. And there
Mm.
were fire stories about these things and that they were these weird leopard colored eels that would climb up out of the water across the road and go back into the water.
Mm.
There was a story of a scientist who was driving through a storm one night in Georgia and came upon a road flooded with leopard eels that were all coming back into the water after getting displaced. That guy actually had that sighting. He is well known by the person, David Steen, who described the species after actually catching one of these things. And so this is a fantastic story where you have this
Mm.
weird or of this maned land walking eel with leopard skin that turns out to be real, to be absolutely real. And it isn't that far off from what people describe either, but it fits into zoology quite well.
Yeah.
And when you have a story like that, you then really have to sit there and be like, okay, well, you can't really mock folklore that much anymore after
No.
that.
Well, I mean,
Um,
I think folklore, local legend is very, very important. I
mm,
often wonder, you made a very good point there about the leopard eel, the descriptions that locals were giving essentially a large salamander, an unknown salamander. Um, what would people have said about the okapi? Well, it's kind of like a horse with a short giraffe's neck. It's got a giraffe's head, and it's a horse, but it has zebra legs. Like,
mm,
yeah, sure. It's a horse with a giraffe's
exactly.
head and zebra legs. I'm sure you saw that.
Mm,
And yet, it's such a strange creature when you see it. Who would have believed something like that existed? It's amazing, and I think oftentimes when people, I always bring this point up, when they see something they don't have a reference for in their mental library, they pick from the things that they know. So the classic example is the Aztecs, Moctezuma, sorry, and seeing Cortez's ships and imagining them to be mountains, floating mountains. I'm sure
Yes,
they
right.
didn't look like mountains, but that's the best thing that they could describe
Mm,
the shape of the ship. And the same with everything else. Even the gorillas, they were hairy men of the forest. They were our hairy men of the forest back
yes,
then.
right.
Um, I think there's a story of Hannah the explorer, the Carthaginian explorer, actually landing on in West Africa somewhere. I don't know if it's Sierra Leone or somewhere else. And anyway, encountering this tribe, he said of hairy, savage women.
Mm. Yes, I know this
Yeah,
story. Yes.
yes. And it's amazing. It's just so amazing. Clearly, gorillas of some kind, or some kind of ape anyway, and they imagined them to be people.
Mm.
They were a type of people.
Well, there's a person like.
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, they're more person-like than some of the people I've known. That's for sure. Um, yeah. So there you go. I mean, I think it's very interesting. Now, coming away from that, the troubles, the trials and tribulations of cryptozoology. Let's talk about your new documentary, release the Baudet film. Now,
Right.
I've been to Lake Champlain only once for a few days, um, astounded by the size of it.
Mm.
I've been to Loch Ness so many times, and that's only about 25 miles long, about a mile and a half across. It's deep, but it seems big if you live here. But to go to a lake that's 114, 115 miles long, 40 miles at its widest, um, it's a really amazing environment. There was so much wildlife around. I was really impressed by what I saw there. I didn't see Champ, but
Mm.
it was easy to conceive of something like that living in this body of water.
Mm.
You've obviously been there recently filming your new documentary, and a little sort of side note on the Champ legend, which is about this Baudet film. Now I know what this sighting is, but just describe for the people listening what was the Baudet sighting, and why are we trying to get that film released? What's
Mm.
the issue?
I think the core idea of why I'd like to get the bullet sighting before I describe it publicized a bit more is exactly tied very directly into our previous topic, and it's that zoological discovery is often cryptozoological before it's zoological. Which you might even use that to make the argument that cryptozoology is zoology. It's just the frontier of zoology, which is, I think, roughly what it is that we're looking at. Now, the Bodut film is a very interesting case. Well, here's the outline. In 2005, I think it was June or July of 2005, these two local fishermen in New York, Peter Baudet and his stepfather, Dick Alfelter, they're out near the southern mouth of the Ausable River in New York, which feeds right into Lake Champlain.
Mm-hmm.
And according to them, and there's actually a transcript of an interview that got scrapped with them that was very interesting. Uh, this roughly half-hour event ensued in which there were these couple of serpentine-esque animals that were coming up right next to the boat. According to the interview, Dick Alfelter even was concerned that they were going to ram the boat at one point. So they were up and pretty close, whatever they were. And they shot not spotty in the sense of quality, but spotty in the sense of timing footage
Mm-hmm.
because the camera allegedly was kind of broken and kept cutting in and out. So there are clips that form the entire footage rather
Okay.
than an entire length of footage.
Not continuous. Yeah.
Yeah. And after it was shot, they, for whatever reason, and there's a bit of debate over why this happened, although some theories are championed more than others perhaps because Baudet said something about it himself. I'm not sure. The reason we call it the Baudet film was because Baudet himself was the cameraman.
Mm-hmm.
They sold it to a lawyer in New Jersey named Scott Shagan, who Pete Baudet knew. And Shagan wanted to have a bit of it aired on the ABC network in 2006.
Mm-hmm.
And ABC aired some of it for their story on Champ. And it was only cumulatively about 10 seconds of the footage, maybe a bit more. And whatever the subject of the footage is only on screen for maybe 2 seconds. But even those 2 seconds are actually relatively impressive. They're actually very impressive because it's very clear. Whatever it is, the shape of it is very clear. It's not just a silhouette either, it's detailed. And it certainly does seem like an object that is close to the boat. There's also footage in those clips that they aired of these massive wakes in the water that are completely circular. So that's a strange phenomenon also happening at the water at the same time this other thing is happening. Unfortunately, that was all that got aired. And according to some sources, Shagan was not very happy about that, and that's why it hasn't been aired since, because he saw the situation as, well, clearly a television network has no idea what to air from this footage because that was nowhere near the best shot. According to that transcript I mentioned, Peter Baudet believes the best shot of the film is when this thing's head actually comes right above the water next to the boat, and it can be seen in very detail. He said that in the sunset, or relative sunset at least, it's getting close to that time period apparently in the day, you can even see the sun glinting off the eye. So some pretty heavy detail. Peter Baudet said it had a seal-like head, although he did describe the body as serpentine, which is interesting because that's kind of not exactly what you expect from a typical champ report. And it hasn't been seen since. This thing has been in Shagan's property desk file, whatever, for about 15 years now. And it's never gotten anywhere beyond where it was then. Some people have seen the full footage. They've been asked to sign these disclosure deals that essentially say you can't talk about it much after you see it. Some people have broken those. I'm not sure if they'll get into hot water or not. They certainly haven't yet. But it's also hasn't been big news that they've broken it either. Mainly because this piece of footage isn't talked about very much. It's kind of one of the main goals of this documentary, because this is, even in its current state, a very astounding piece of footage. I mean, the analysis of the 7 or so frames that this thing is in frame for, even those are enough to make you think, wow, I wish I could see this whole thing, because this is pretty incredible stuff. There are different opinions on what exactly is happening, but there's definitely something happening, which is, it's hard to get people to agree on that in this field.
No, I mean, it really is. I'm just wondering, has a bit, obviously you've really looked into this video documentary, but has the direct contact been made with this lawyer? Is he asking a price, or is it just off the books? You can't
Right.
see. Did the people who viewed it, did they pay to view it?
These people, I think they did not pay a full price, as in like a release price, to look at it. They may have paid some kind of monetary compensation for it. As far as I know, they did not. I have not been told that they did, but I haven't been told that they did. There is a price, roughly speaking, that he's put on it, that Shagan's put on it for a public release, which the most he's been offered is 10,000, and he laughed at that and said 20,000 would do it.
Okay.
And yeah, right.
Just to release it, not to own it, not to buy it. Like, if you pay 20,000, I'll put this out there, and you can all see it.
Right.
It's interesting though. Stuff like this happens with Loch Ness footage all the time. Well, and I don't mean that somebody holds onto it and sort of levies ransom on it, but it just disappears. People lose interest. It has its day in the sun on television and newspapers, and especially before now, and it disappears, and can't even find these bits of footage on the internet. Anyway, and some of them are very, very good. And it's interesting to me. 15 years to hang on to something that you hope will make you some money seems a bit odd. At some point you'd sort of deal. You say, well, look, it's been 15 years. Nobody's paying this money. It's 5. Give me 5 and I'll put it out on the internet.
Yeah, that's a very good question to ask in this scenario. And it's difficult because the ultimatum isn't one that seems to justify that either, because either you have a real piece of footage that might very well be just enough for one legitimate scientist to say, hey, we might need some more conservation laws at this lake. This thing looks real, and whatever it is should be studied. Maybe that's enough. We don't know if it is. The people who have seen it certainly think to say that it is. Now, it's either that or it's a fake, and I don't think anyone should pay $20,000 for a hoax that isn't theirs. And I also don't think that it's morally correct, and I would think that most people would agree, it isn't morally upholdable to hold hostage evidence of a potentially endangered radical new species for $20,000.
I think I don't know American law, but I'm feeling that there's some loophole in there, some environmental loophole, species protection loophole, in which the person can be prosecuted for possibly withholding evidence of a creature in need of environmental protection, habitat protection. but it would be difficult. But that would
Yes,
be
well,
my view. That would be my view. How can we get this guy? What kind of loophole? What kind of environmental nut jobs can we turn on this prick to
hopefully,
make him release this
that's
footage?
a really good question, and believe me, that's one that I begged the question in the
Yeah,
documentary. But it's hard because it's difficult to get this kind of phenomenon recognized
yeah,
zoologically, right?
of
And
course.
it mainly is, I think, for the reasons that you and I have talked about, which is that it's either made fun of by the people who claim to be in this subject. The people who are actually investigating it don't put their stuff out there enough, and so it's like the story doesn't really end anywhere.
Mm.
Whereas some Loch Ness monster photos, like the recent one, the hump that's going in the water, that's actually from a catfish photograph.
Yeah, oh
Um,
yeah, yeah,
Story has an ending, and a lot of people don't know that story has an ending. And if they just
yeah.
went online and looked at more Facebook groups or looked at more forums, they would find it, but they need to look for it. So hopefully, things like the channel put it out there more. And of course, the third one is that people hold on to things, and so it's kind of questionable why we should look into it.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, the holding on definitely begs the question. If you really
yeah,
had something, you would have tried to make from it right now. You know, you're a lawyer, you're in it for the money. That's why you've got it. Maybe
mm,
you bought it in the first place and you were kind of a little bit disappointed with what you got.
right.
Anyway, who knows? I mean, clearly some people have seen it. It looks very interesting, and the documentary looks very interesting. It's available now, isn't it? Yeah, so I do intend to watch it.
It's not
Haven't seen.
available yet, actually.
Oh, it's
The
not.
trailer for it just came out, and we're
Aha.
hoping to have Christmas 2020.
Okay, okay, fantastic. So I
Yeah.
haven't been a terrible person and not watched it yet. It's not bad. Good. Um, so look it, I will have watched it by the time Christmas comes around. So I mean, that being said, all of these things right there, there is, in my opinion, just by the anecdotal sightings alone, this is not Loch Ness Lake Champlain. You don't get the same kind of fanfare and fan base for having a sighting as you would in Loch Ness. Even when I visited, I thought, I would expect champ stores to be all around the place and lots of champ monster tours set up around the lake, and there was nothing really. It was a beautiful lake for fishing that it obviously already had uh, its own tourist base based upon the location that it was in. Champ didn't seem to be such a big thing, as far as I could see.
Yeah, and that was interesting to notice that, and I really can't tell you why, because, well, quite frankly, because you'd think it would be. Most other cryptid subjects involve tourism being heightened, even Sasquatch, getting outside the lake monster perspective, even very local cryptids, ones that aren't really seen beyond their little encapsulated scopes have more than Champ tends to. And
Yeah.
one of the reasons I think that that might be the case is because the evidence that, it's a bit of a paradox. The evidence that we have for Champ, as far as I'm concerned, is probably the best scientific evidence we have out there for just about any proposed cryptid.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that maybe once you get into something that is that scientifically viable, maybe it's a bit less attractive to a tourist because it's not as simplified. And I don't
Yeah.
mean that as in dumbed down. I mean that as
No,
in
I know what you mean.
flashy and quick, whereas scientific inquiry is kind of long and boring for a lot of people.
It's lacking some mystery.
Yes, a little bit.
It's lacking
A
a little
little
mystery. That makes perfect sense to me.
bit.
It's like taking a ghost tour to see and knowing you're going to see ghosts when you get there.
Mm.
Well, if I'm going to see ghosts when I get there, maybe I won't go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's that, and
Yeah,
it's also, let's say when you went on the ghost tour, somebody gave you a 2-hour lecture on how EVP spectrograms work.
yeah,
Like you wouldn't necessarily spend, the money on that if you were just going for a small ghost tour.
exactly.
If you
Where are
wanted
the
a chance,
ghosts, buddy?
yeah, exactly. You don't want a 2-hour lecture on the echolocations, which
Mm,
maybe you should want, but people don't tend to.
no.
You want to go out and see a hump in the water.
What are your opinions on the echolocation evidence, the Muggenthaler evidence?
Well, specifically the Muggenthaler recordings, I think, is the best evidence for any unknown species in North America right now. Um, I try my best to be a very objective person, and I call absolutely everything into question that I possibly can, and that leads to most things being open ended, and that's fine as far as I'm concerned. This is not as open ended, which makes it kind of a different game.
Mm,
This is not made by people who are wackos who went onto the lake with a recording mic one day. These are people who were established in their fields, who did not, Muggenthaler specifically, did not
Mm.
delve much into Champ before this happened. Again, along with the Tishkov sighting. Um, and they got this echolocation sound that, considering all of that being the case, does not seem to be a hoax.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely echolocation because it doesn't resemble other things in the lake. Even recordings afterwards resemble things like drumfish. This
Yeah.
is not fish. This
I've
is a
heard yeah,
location.
I've heard the first, and I've heard, or at least it was the first I was showing on the Monster Quest documentary. I've heard the drumfish
Mm.
recordings, and they're definitely very, very different.
Yeah,
Very
and of course similar sounds, but it's interesting because what you hear with drumfish isn't necessarily a series of clicks. It's a series of spaced out low taps that are kind of preceded in between by this almost like the sound of rubber stretching, this sort of sequence. Whereas the Muggenthaler recordings um, are a high pitched orca wail, from
different.
what we can tell. And
It did. I mean, to me, that was my first thought. Citation. You know,
yeah,
this is some kind of whale. Um, well, I mean, the jury's out now. There aren't many proponents of the plesiosaur theory when it comes to lake monsters. I know I'm
mm,
one of them. I know Scott is another.
right.
I was under the impression it was just the two of us out there, still hanging on since the 30s. Both of us. What's your feeling on that? Plesiosaur theory, yes or no?
Well, I think that in most freshwater lakes, I would definitely put it relatively low on the list, and but not so with Lake Champlain necessarily, because Lake Champlain used to be the Champlain Sea. This
Hmm.
isn't a lake that used to be even just open to the sea, more so than it is now. This used to be the ocean. This was not an iceberg that melted, or sorry, glacier, I should say.
Uh-huh.
Now, and plesiosaurs had a great deal of biodiversity, one that people don't really know much about. Just talking to Scott for this documentary,
Mm.
I learned that there were horned plesiosaurs in Australia, of all places, living in relatively cold waters.
Hmm.
So when you think of horned champ sightings, and you think of the horned plesiosaur that lived in cold waters, um, doesn't convince me that there's plesiosaurs in the lake. No, but does it open it up to me much more than it was before I learned that? Absolutely, it
Uh-huh.
does. That's a biological model that's very similar to what people describe, maybe more so than any species that we really know of in the fossil record.
Uh-huh.
Um, the idea of the identity theory is very interesting because I find often that identity theories fall a bit short, pretty much every one of them, as far as I'm concerned. And what we end up with is we have to consider that what we're looking at is something new. This
Hmm.
is not something that's very close to a plesiosaur or very close to a pinniped. This might be not just a new animal, but a new kind of animal.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I mean, I think that's yeah, that's a very good point, and definitely worthy. I mean, we'll go through all of these mental stretches to try to make it work. Now, of course, we only have fossil evidence really for the existence of plesiosaurs, so there's a lot of guesswork. Me and Scott talk a lot about the cloacal respiration idea, the
Mm,
theory that, like something like the hawks river turtle, maybe these animals have a similar propensity to convert water to oxygen and stay under for extended periods of time.
mm,
That would be fantastic. It's a get out of jail free card, in my opinion,
yes, in
because
some
you
sense.
just throw it in there and say, well, okay, so we don't see them very often. That's why it works.
Mm,
Because they've got this cloacal respiration. They don't have to come up for air so often. And once again, we have a viable monster living in a, like
yes.
Loch Ness, in a secluded body of water, a small body of water relatively, and that's one idea. I know a lot of people go for the Tully idea, but
Mhm.
that to me is a bit of a huge stretch because these creatures are very very small.
Mm.
You've got to you've got to magnify it by 1,000 times to make it fit into that. Um, Salamanders, slugs. Somebody even mentioned a giant mud skipper with a lure that appeared to resemble a plesiosaur neck and head. And my response was, well, what's it using that lure to catch? Surely that's a lot more exciting than the creature itself.
Right.
It has
Right.
a 10-foot lure on its head. What's it luring in?
Mm,
And that wasn't answered. Yeah. So look, I think it's all very very interesting. Let's get away from the lake monsters a little bit because um, that case is not going to be solved for a little while. As exciting as it is,
yes.
what about Sasquatch? I mean, clearly, even though it was entertaining, if the Finding Bigfoot show taught us nothing else, it taught us that people believe they're seeing Sasquatch all over the United States and
Mm.
Canada too. What are your opinions on this? Could there be uh, a continent-wide, or let's say a nationwide population of these animals, or again, is this the kind of creature that everybody wants a piece of for their own, for their own team?
Mm.
What do you think?
Well, I definitely think that there is that social aspect to it. That's certainly the case. I have no doubt about that. The Sasquatch phenomenon is very interesting because, when you're conducting a scientific inquiry, your goal is to disprove your theory because you're human and you're flawed, and chances are you're dead wrong.
Yeah.
Um, the thing about the Sasquatch phenomenon is that, as far as I'm concerned, the more and more you examine the kind of data that's coming in and in the quantity such data is coming in, the more it disproves that this all could be a massive hoax.
Hmm.
Um, maybe it isn't as good a data as something like echolocation in Lake Champlain, but especially funny enough with behavioral aspects that people report. These are things that sometimes are reported 30 years before we actually know animals in the animal kingdom do them.
Mm.
And when we find out animals do them, they're animals like gorillas and chimpanzees that are the things in the animal kingdom that most closely resemble what people describe when they say they've seen a Sasquatch.
Oh.
Something like wood knocking. Wood knocking's been reported, as far as I'm concerned, I think the last like 50 years or so. We've been getting wood knocking reports very commonly, even in cases like Ape Canyon, vaguely describes something similar to wood knocking. Just around 10 to 20 years ago, we found out that populations of chimps will long distance communicate to each other when they're separated by hitting rocks against trees.
Oh.
And that's wood knocking. That's exactly what that is. You have things like facial expressions being described that were kind of weird. One particular instance in which this kid in the 80s described seeing an ape man that smiled like it was going to attack him, which is a very strange report, until about 30 years later, when we find out that the way that chimps communicate anxiety is with this big toothy grin. And we find that more and more and more as time goes on. There are more and more resemblances between Sasquatch reports and existing primate data, even as far back as just very vague behavioral things that really, I think, lend credibility to the idea that there could be a population of these things that is viable to live in the United States and in northern Canada,
Oh.
because primates are very smart animals. And there's this book called Gorillas in the Mist by this researcher named Diane Fossey,
Yeah.
who, yeah, she was basically the Jane Goodall of gorillas. She
Yeah.
lived with them for a couple of years, her and her crew did. And when they first got to the site of the gorilla habituation area, they were finding signs of gorillas absolutely everywhere, but they did not see a gorilla for 2 weeks.
Mhm.
And when they finally saw one, it wasn't by accident. It stepped out because it was comfortable with them. You will not see a giant hairy primate unless it wants you to see it, and that's how smart they are,
Mhm.
or how cognitively developed they are, I should say. If you have something that's maybe even a bit more developed, it's not really a question whether or not you could find these things, because it's pretty much been proven that, yeah, very large mammals that are man-shaped can hide pretty easily. And they'll hide better than you could ever think that they would hide.
What about bears? Bears hide pretty well, right?
Yeah, there are some hunters you talk to who say, I've never seen a naturally dead bear in my entire life, let alone something that might be half the population of bears, like
Mm.
Sasquatch might be. That, and the fact that not just the places where Sasquatches are being seen, but also where their behaviors are reported, are the areas of the country that are the best built for primates. We have almost none in the very flat, plain-oriented Midwest. We have almost no reports there.
Mhm.
But in the Pacific Northwest, California, and in New England, and down in Florida, and southern Texas, which is some of the most heavily forested areas of the country, and they get the most rainfall in the country,
Mhm.
we have reports of large primates. we don't just have that, we also have this lack of bodies. The amount of rain contributes to the acidity in the soil. We are finding the least amount of animal bodies in these areas too,
Okay.
because the bones don't last as long.
I mean, that makes perfect sense. Anyway, anything that dies in the forest gets eaten up. I mean, people always assume because we have a fossil record that somehow things fossilize. They don't. It's very hard for anything to fossilize. It's
Mm.
like a billion to one chance.
Yeah, it's
So
very rare.
yeah,
It's incredible what
yes,
happens in the first place.
yeah, completely rare. So I think it's very, very possible. One of the things that really surprised me when I was in the United States and New England as well. Actually, I drove through from Portland, New Hampshire, down to Vermont, and
Mm.
was just the sheer amount of forest. I
Oh yeah.
didn't imagine that New England was very forested at all. Never ever heard that.
Oh
And
really?
yet, I never heard that, and it was just endless, endless, beautiful forest. By the way,
Mm.
reminded me of a lot. I mean, it's called New England, I know that, but it reminded me a lot of home up here in
Mm.
some ways, the way everything looked. And even places like Atlanta,
Mm.
flying in to Atlanta Airport, the landing, there was endless forest as far as I could see, as far as the eye could see. I thought, is this
Right.
Atlanta? Am I in Atlanta? This just seems like I've landed in the middle of some sort of lost world, at least from the window view. I was only in the airport apart from that. The United States it's a vast country, and a lot of people in this country don't really understand it, even if they visit, because we go to New York, we go to Florida, or LA, or someplace like that. You just don't get it. The sheer vast, untenanted, unwalked amount of space. Russell Accord was talking on an NPR. He would talk about flying over the Pacific Northwest and being told by the pilot that passenger planes had gone down there in the forest and never been found.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, c- conceiving of a forest in which a passenger plane crashes and cannot be found is really something spectacular. So,
Yes.
just for anybody listening out there, I illustrate that point that it's um, people used to tell me that the UK was small. I'd say, well, it's not small if you're on foot.
Yes. Right.
Um, Similarly, to an extreme point of view, the US has that, and also many environments. And I wouldn't be surprised if something could survive there. Speculation, I know. Now, you said there is lots of evidence of Sasquatch. So let's go over some of that. Let's talk about the footprints, for example. That's one of the
Okay.
most
Right.
popular ones.
Mm.
What are your opinions on that? And are there famous examples that you would hold up to say this is definitely something that's unknown
Mm.
and bona fide? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. There's two examples of those kinds of prints I would say that we can look at in the data sets that we have. On footprints in general, I would say, ironically enough, tread carefully with that. People like John
Okay.
Benedict was an absolute titan in the Bigfoot field. He died 2 years ago, unfortunately. He
Uh,
made the point that wildlife biologists, when they look for signs of animals, they look for tracks. So the tracks
uh-huh.
aren't a non-viable example of evidence. They're not to be written off immediately, but they're also probably the easiest form to fake. They're also the lowest risk to fake. You don't have to worry about someone shooting you in the woods because you look like a bear. Um, Now, that being said, what you should look for then when you look for tracks or when you're examining a proposed track of some kind of North American primate, you need to look for things that disprove that theory. Well, look for things that disprove both theories, essentially. Look for things that disprove. And in most casts, you can't really find that. You find a compelling story behind the cast, and even though that's fantastic and is included in the kind of wider data set, it's nothing that stands out necessarily. There are two examples that do. One is the fact that the Patterson Gimlin tracks don't just resemble Patty's foot in the footage, which is, you could say, well,
Mhm.
obviously costume then leaving footprints is what that means. It's a weighted foot, maybe. It resembles very, very minutely casts that were found of the Chinese wild man, which is referred to
Mhm.
as the Yarra. I think a few decades afterwards. And the Patterson Gimlin film wasn't that well known in China at that point. So that's interesting because then you're like,
Mhm.
okay, we have examples of these things that are literally like you could almost argue they came from the same individual.
Mhm.
And That's pretty shocking. That's a bit. It doesn't quite turn the boat over, but it shakes it a bit, and you're like, okay, that's some interesting data right there.
That's strong. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other example, which I think is maybe even better than this, is what's called the Olympus track. The Olympus track was found in Olympus, Washington, I think 2004, 2008 maybe. And it's a very small track, actually. It might be what, if this is a North American primate, it might be a juvenile, or even an infant. It's only about, maybe this big or something like that. But it was found in mud. It was found in mud that was the proper temperature and consistency to hold some really minute detail. And one of those details happened to be dermal ridges, which are, your fingerprints are examples of dermal ridges. They're the very minute skin cuts that exist all across your hand and all across the pads of your feet, especially in your toes. But again, they're all across your foot. And if you look at this track, it's abundantly clear that those are there, and they're not mistakes because they follow specific patterns. They're not made by plants because no plants are able to be that thin enough to make those, and they're not shaped correctly, and they can't be broken to be shaped correctly either. So, and they're so thin that I don't think you could fake them in plaster or mud because they're so tiny and minute that traces of an object coming through them to form them would be abundantly clear. And they're not abundantly clear. They're not clear at all. And that's very significant. That's the hardest thing you could possibly try and fake in a track, in some pretty tough conditions to fake it, in an area where there is nobody walking. That's losing my cool a bit there.
No, I mean, you feel strongly about it, and I understand that because, I mean, clearly, it's viable evidence. It's very strong evidence. I mean, the frustration is obviously that it's not accepted scientifically or by the general community, but still, it's there. For me, tracks have for a long time. I'm no expert in them because we have such a lack of them here with the phenomenon that we've investigated that it's almost been the nail in the coffin of the British Bigfoot, the lack of any tracks of any kind. Yes, I think it's very interesting. It's at least verifiable. It can be faked. I know Cliff said he was taken in by some by the London tracks. Is that right? A long time ago, and he's since learned a lot from that. But it's hard to do.
Yes,
really hard to do. And there's not many people out there with the skills, really, especially with what you're describing, to carve dermal ridges, individualistic dermal ridges, into a tiny Sasquatch foot. Why would you make it small if you're faking it?
Yes, then that begs the question.
Yeah.
It's definitely viable that the more complicated you make it, the more it seems real. But there's a certain point where the more complicated you make it, the more difficult and impossible it becomes to actually make it. And as far as I'm concerned, the Olympus track kind of crosses that threshold.
Yeah, well, this is also the point. If you're faking a Bigfoot track, why would you make it a small track? You'd make it a big track because you want people to think it's a Bigfoot track and not a child's footprint.
Yes, exactly. That's another problem is who said this isn't just some baby that you had with you that you dipped into the mud with their foot really quick and were like, oh, now I can cast that and people will believe me.
This track, I mean, this is the track equivalent of the breasts on the Patterson Gimlin subject.
Yes,
why?
Exactly.
Why? In all likelihood, if you've got a suit, you've got a great suit, I just put some breasts on it, okay? Oh, don't put breasts on it. You're going too far. I would just stick them on. It'll make it more authentic. Nobody would think like that. Nobody. It's amazing to me. There's some amazing stuff like that. We do have to wrap it up, but it's been fascinating. I have to do it again.
Absolutely.
I learned so much from your channel, and I am writing Beasts of North America. I just keep telling myself, you're going to have to get information that's not from Karac's channel. You have to go further afield. I'm kidding, but
to hear that it's doing its job. That's very uplifting to know that this is giving the proper kind of information at the proper quantity.
It's the way I like it, and I just love the delivery. So thank you for that. Just very quickly, where can we all find you, and how can people help if they want to?
Right. Well, I obviously have the Course Cryptozoology YouTube channel. There's also a Facebook group and a website for it. I can be reached most easily on Facebook for any kind of inquiry. My email is crash.course.cryptozoology@gmail.com. yeah, just any of those avenues that are communication based would be the best to reach me.
Fantastic. Karac, thank you so much for coming on. I advise everybody to find the channel, watch it, take it all in before you do any more scorching or lake monster hunting or anything at all, and get yourself a nice, balanced, scientific approach like Karac has. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thank you very much.